Taiwanese foundries controlled 78.1% of the global pure-play semiconductor wafer fabrication market in 2024, according to data from the Taiwan Semiconductor Industry Association. This extreme geographic concentration creates an absolute structural dependency for global technology infrastructure, as advanced logic chips cannot be substituted or rapidly replicated. A physical disruption to this single node immediately halts downstream production lines across consumer electronics, automotive, and defense sectors globally. Macro Frontier maps the structural realities of international capital allocation. We track the foundational data points driving global supply chain resilience. Macro Frontier. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company commanded a historic 67.6% share of the broader pure-play foundry market in the first quarter of 2025, according to data verified by Counterpoint Research. This aggregation understates the structural reality at the leading edge, where TSMC controls over 90% of global fabrication capacity for advanced sub-5 nanometer logic nodes. Competitors like Samsung Foundry held only 7.7% of the market in early 2025, severely limited by suboptimal operational yields on gate-all-around architectures. China's leading alternative, SMEC, remains structurally isolated at a 5% to 6% market share due to international export controls restricting access to advanced lithography equipment. This asymmetry leaves the entire global technology stack reliant on a single corporate entity for the processing units required by hyperscale cloud networks and sovereign computing clusters. The transmission mechanism operates via the absolute physical reliance on extreme ultraviolet lithography tools optimized within TSMC facilities. The structural result for global technology infrastructure is a total absence of supply elasticity if Taiwanese fabrication nodes experience unprogrammed downtime. Data from TrendForce reveals that TSMC has implemented structural price increases of 15% on 3nm wafers for the latter half of 2026, alongside projected 5 to 10% hikes on mature nodes. Because no alternative entity produces comparable volumes of advanced silicon, major fabless designers like NVIDIA, Apple, and AMD are forced to absorb these capital inputs entirely. A standard 300mm wafer on the 3nm node commands a base price exceeding $18,000, establishing a high capital baseline for next-generation hardware manufacturing. This vertical pricing leverage reflects TSMC's 43.1% operating profit margin, contrasted sharply with legacy-bound competitors like SMSC at 6.1%. Capital flows demonstrate that hardware developers are actively sacrificing margin to secure guaranteed wafer allocations inside Taiwanese facilities. The transmission mechanism functions through the inelastic demand curve for frontier computational performance. The structural consequence for global technology markets is an elevated inflationary floor across all downstream artificial intelligence applications and server hardware architectures. Macroeconomic modeling by Bloomberg Economics indicates that a comprehensive maritime blockade of the Taiwan Strait would inflict an estimated $10.6 trillion shock on the global economy, reducing global gross domestic product by 5% within the initial phase. Modern industrial supply chains operate on highly optimized, just-in-time logistics frameworks with a standard transit window of 7 to 14 days from fabrication plants to downstream assembly nodes. Within a 30-day blockade horizon, global component inventories for consumer electronics would be completely exhausted, halting production lines across approximately $1.2 trillion of electronics manufacturing. The physical disruption of maritime and aerial corridors immediately severs international access to 67% of total global foundry output. The transmission mechanism is the immediate cessation of finished wafer shipments to global packaging and testing hubs. The structural result for the international industrial base is a synchronized cessation of electronic device assembly across major manufacturing hubs in North America, Europe, and continental Asia. Extending a blockade scenario to a 90-day timeline triggers critical energy depletion inside Taiwan, which imports over 97% of its total energy supply, according to national statistical data. While statutory petroleum reserves hover near 160 days, The island's advanced fabrication infrastructure relies on uninterrupted, high-voltage baseload electricity to maintain hyper-pure cleanroom environments and run lithography machines. A prolonged quarantine of liquefied natural gas imports forces rolling electrical grid curtailments, compelling advanced fabs to initiate controlled shutdowns of multi-billion-dollar equipment. Revitalizing an advanced logic fabrication facility after an unprogrammed power disruption requires months of recalibration, multiplying the structural recovery timeline even after maritime access is restored. The transmission mechanism is the physical degradation of precision manufacturing equipment under variable power conditions. The structural consequence for the global economy is a multi-year hardware depression, characterized by long-term structural supply deficits that cannot be bypassed by alternative international production facilities. The United States creating helpful incentives to produce Semiconductors Act of 2022 allocated $52.7 billion in total federal funding, with $39 billion directly earmarked for domestic manufacturing grants. By mid-2025, the Department of Commerce announced over $33 billion in conditional allocations across 40 projects, yet a persistent lag remains between public announcements and physical capital disbursements. A July 2025 evaluation by the Government Accountability Office reported that corporate recipients had verified completion for only 24 out of 161 mandatory contractual milestones. Actual funding remains strictly constrained by the completion of rigorous regulatory hurdles, including the National Environmental Policy Act review process, which historically averages over 4 years for industrial installations. The transmission mechanism operates through bureaucratic verification gates, designed to minimize state capital misallocation. The structural result for the domestic semiconductor industry is an extended operational latency between initial capital allocation and the actual deployment of operational factory infrastructure. The domestic build-out faces severe structural bottlenecks in human capital, with independent industry projections estimating an acute deficit of 90,000 specialized operational personnel in the United States by 2030. TSMC's $165 billion multi-phase megasite in Phoenix, Arizona, and Intel's $20 billion project in New Albany, Ohio, have both deferred initial production timelines due to shortages of highly specialized construction and mechanical engineers. These labor constraints have triggered friction with regional trade unions, driving upward structural adjustments to total project costs. While TSMC targets local 4nm production ahead of transitioning toward 2nm capabilities by 2030, these facilities remain heavily dependent on technicians sourced directly from overseas nodes for precision tool installation. The transmission mechanism is the inelastic supply of domestic advanced engineering talent. The structural consequence for international technology supply chains is a protracted multi-year window where geographic diversification remains a theoretical policy target rather than a functional manufacturing reality. Detailed econometric modeling by Tech Insights establishes that direct and indirect human labor accounts for less than 2% of the total long-term operational cost of a 300mm sub-5nm silicon wafer. Over 65% of the total manufacturing cost is driven purely by the capital depreciation schedules of advanced equipment, such as $200 million extreme ultraviolet lithography systems. Consequently, when adjusting for automated workflows and equipment parity, the structural cost to process an identical wafer at TSMC's Arizona Fab 21 is modeled to be less than 10% higher than in Hsinchu, Taiwan. This nominal cost variance invalidates the common thesis that Western labor costs render advanced domestic fabrication unviable. The transmission mechanism is the overwhelming capital intensity of machinery depreciation relative to localized wage inputs. The structural consequence for global technology architecture is that the geographic relocation of silicon production is limited by initial greenfield capital access, not by structural labor cost differentials. European diversification efforts highlight severe operational utility vulnerabilities, particularly regarding structural energy cost inflation. In Dresden, Germany, the European Semiconductor Manufacturing Company broke ground on a €10 billion fabrication facility targeting mature automotive nodes by 2027. backed by a €5 billion state subsidy. However, advanced semiconductor manufacturing consumes immense baseload power, scaling from 400 kilowatt-hours per wafer at legacy nodes to over 1,000 kilowatt-hours at advanced scales. An equivalent manufacturing facility operating in Germany faces an estimated $160 million in annual electricity costs, compared to $54 million for a parallel installation in Texas. The transmission mechanism is the structural divergence in regional utility pricing for high-volume industrial consumers. The structural result for continental European electronics manufacturing is an unhedged operational cost premium that compresses the long-term international competitiveness of domestic manufacturing consortia. The global automotive market is executing a structural transition away from volume-driven production metrics toward content-driven silicon integration. Advanced driver assistance systems and localized vehicle processing units are migrating rapidly to sub-5 nanometer architectures, as evidenced by Renesas Electronics' deployment of 3 nanometer automotive systems on chip for real-time perception. Disruptions within the Taiwan Strait would immediately cripple these next-generation automotive assembly lines, replicating the structural dynamics of the 2021 chip deficit, but at a vastly amplified scale. Concurrently, the artificial intelligence sector remains bound to TSMC's custom 4nm and 4np nodes, which power NVIDIA's Hopper and Blackwell Ultra architectures. The Blackwell Ultra features 208 billion transistors and demands specialized packaging infrastructure completely concentrated in Taiwan. The transmission mechanism operates via the absolute lack of alternative production pipelines for advanced multi-die accelerators. The structural result is an immediate freezing of capital expenditure deployments among global cloud service providers. The national defense sector displays an insulated yet highly complex dependency profile regarding semiconductor manufacturing. The United States Department of Defense allocates over $2 billion annually to specialized microelectronics procurement, with recent funding trends expanding by 20% year-over-year to support tactical stockpiling. Strategic systems like the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter rely heavily on mature, radiation-hardened logic nodes ranging from 32 nanometers to 90 nanometers to prevent cosmic radiation bit flips in flight environments. To secure supply lines for scalable munitions, the Pentagon is executing fixed-price procurement programs like the Low-Cost Containerized Missiles Initiative, targeting 10,000 units by 2027. While these legacy architectures are partially insulated from sub-5 nanometer disruptions, Taiwanese foundries still account for a critical volume of global mature node production capacity. The transmission mechanism is the depletion of legacy component inventories across global aerospace suppliers. The structural consequence is a severe degradation in the replenishment velocity of precision munition stockpiles during extended industrial mobilizations. Data from the World Semiconductor Trade Statistics indicates that global semiconductor revenue is projected to exceed $1 trillion by 2028. Driven by an unhedged structural expansion in the memory and logic segments. Capital expenditure patterns reveal that despite hundreds of billions of dollars in Western state interventions, the core center of gravity for advanced fabrication remains anchored within the Asia-Pacific theater. South Korea is deploying $470 billion into the Yongin megacluster to consolidate its hegemony over high-bandwidth memory, while Japan's Rapidus initiative targets autonomous 2-nanometer logic competency by 2027. This competitive concentration guarantees that the global technology supply chain will maintain an inelastic dependency on the physical stability of the East Asian maritime corridors for the remainder of the decade. Capital flows will continue to price in a structural geographic risk premium, as the physical duplication of this manufacturing ecosystem requires at least 10 years of uninterrupted capital deployment. This analysis was produced by Macro Frontier. Subscribe for structural macroeconomic intelligence. The data does not care whether you are watching.